Our next speaker is Jakub Banasiak. Is it Sak?
Shak.
Shak, sorry. You know, I still have a long way to go. I first open your PPT. Just to have it. The floor is yours. So Jakub Banasiak is an art historian and art critic, assistant professor at the Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw, Faculty of Artistic Research and Curatorial Studies. He's also the author of the book entitled Through Those Times, The Decay of the State Art System between 82 and 93, which was published in 2020. He's the editor-in-chief of the academic journal,
Miejsce.
And also the Sum magazine. I'm sure you know both. And he is also active as a curator with an exhibition of his work, Tectonic Movements, in the Art Museum of Lodz, which presented his research on esotericism and unconventional spiritualities in Polish art in the late 80s and early 90s, and he's currently working on a book on the same subject.
Yep. Thank you very much. And in fact, my paper fit to the previous panel, and I think it's a great luck or coincidence, because I will be speaking about the commons. Okay, so as the title of my paper communicates, my main theoretical inspiration is Silvia Federici's significant and inspiring book entitled Re-enchanting the World. As I will try to show, this metaphor allows us not only to see the limits of critical art history of the transition era, but also to recognize those art phenomena that have been overlooked by it. And this is the main stake of my presentation. So, the concept of re-enchanting grows out of a new research on the primitive accumulation. In classical Marxism, the primitive accumulation referred to a specific, accomplished, one-time historical event, the enclosure of the commons, especially communal land, which took place on a large scale in the 18th and first half of the 19th centuries. As Marx writes, the effect of primitive accumulation was, quote, the separation of the producer from the means of productions, end of quote. Therefore, historical materialism presents primitive accumulation as a necessary precondition for the emergence of capitalist society after feudalism. Back in the 1990s, Silvia Federici was one of the researchers working on a new understanding of primitive accumulation. Federici, among others, has showed that primitive accumulation is not so much the reason, the cause of the emergence of capitalism, but rather its structural feature. In these terms, primitive accumulation is a condition but of capitalism survival. In order to capitalism, in order to develop, must appropriate or dispossesses its outsides. And this is the term of Federici. The motivation for research on this issue was the expansion of neoliberalism. From the viewpoint of Federici, so-called globalization or end of history, westernization, democratization, and so on, is a process of primitive accumulation imposed on a global scale, when nothing stands in the way of the capital anymore. This process affects all regions where the commons and the public sector are privatized or commercialized, including Central and Eastern Europe during the transition era, of course. To capture the totality of this process, Federici introduced the term new enclosures. However, Federici's most important contribution to the theory of primitive accumulation is the discovery that enclosures concern not only land of resources and so on, but also and above all the onto-epistemology of social life. As she points out, capitalism is always tearing apart social and material wholes. But the most important, most basic whole is our primordial bond with nature. The earth, animals, other people, our bodies, finally, the entire cosmos or universe. Consequently, it is only the logic of capitalist development that pre-modern forms of community are defining as backward, irrational, and so on. Therefore, Federici suggests that we should rethink Max Weber's concept of disenchantment of the world and interpret it as a part or a type of the enclosures of non-capitalist commons. And it is in this context that Federici formulates the postulate of re-enchanting the world. As she emphasizes, it's not about, quote, yearning for an impossible return to a primitivist paradise, but about discovering of reasons and logics other than those of capitalist development. End of quote. After 1989, when the Central and Eastern Europe has ceased to be a capitalist outside, also art has been included in the logic of the new neoliberal enclosures. And this was brilliantly demonstrated by Octavian Esanu in his recent book, The Post-Socialist Contemporary, although he obviously did not apply Federici's terms, but it's also about enclosures and the commons, in fact. As Esanu points out, the post-socialist contemporary was not just, quote, a product of, but also agent in the constitution of post-1989 economic and cultural neoliberalism. And Esanu describes in detail the institutional effects of this conjuncture, but in the perspective adopted here, for me, the most important are analyses of the onto-epistemological, which also means ideological, basis of this new order. Esanu shows that Karl Popper's concept of an open society was most important here. For Popper, who can be considered as one of the most important thinkers for transitional elites, also in Poland, the poverty of historicism and the open society and its enemies have been translated in samizdat as early as the 1980s in Poland. So, for Popper, quote, communal living and sharing is a romantic fiction, a vestige of ancient tribal mentality. Group and collective sentiments in general tend to be denounced as tribals, end quote. And therefore, in public debate, of the transition era, of course, and also in contemporary art discourse, the idea of equality has been replaced by the idea of freedom, the idea of utopia by the idea of rationality, the idea of community by the idea of individualism, and so on and so on, and also irony has become important here. One of the crucial results of this new epistemology was the concept of anti-politics. It was based on the belief that after the end of history, the main task of critical thinking is to identify the violence of any larger wholeness or totality and so on against the individual. Consequently, the politics of modernism, based on the idea of universalism, essentialism, and so on, has been replaced, quote, by a plethora of micro-political singularities, according to ethnicity, gender, religion, intolerance, and so on. This led to the emerging of a new model of art, which Esanu calls issue-based art, and a new figure of artist who was now to be a problem solver. As Esanu shows, both were part of the most important goal of the post-communist transition, catching up with the West. Although Esanu focuses on the Soros centers of contemporary art and just mentions art history, he makes it clear that also this field was under the logic of post-socialist contemporary. I would like to briefly outline this correlation on the basis of 3 books of Piotr Piotrowski, published in the 1990s and untranslated into English. So, as you all well aware, Piotrowski was the most important and influential Polish art historian after 1989. However, it is worth recalling that he was also a representative of the Polish liberal and anti-communist intelligentsia, which co-created the Polish reality of the transition era in the spirit of an open society. So, the first book published by Piotrowski after the fall of communism is from 1991 and it's titled The Decade. The title refers to the period of the 1970s, which has been described as a time of political passivity of artists and their financial dependence on the state. This applied to both the neo-avant-garde and traditional artists belonging to the Polish Artists Union. The key point here was the juxtaposition of the socialist state social functions, like patronage and so on, and its cultural policy. As two examples, like 2 sides of the same coin, 2 examples of state violence, which, as Karl Popper presented, can forcibly impose its vision of the world, but also unfairly impose equality. It should be remembered that in 1991 there were ongoing protests by the artists' unions, including visual artists, actors, writers, and others, against the neoliberal liquidation of state patronage, one might say against the new enclosures. The liberal intelligentsia supported also this element of shock therapy, and one of its most common arguments was to invoke communism as a system in which art patronage was just a function of cultural policy. In the new socio-political reality, the artist, like any member of society, was to be the architect of his own fate. The decade was in keeping with this discourse willy-nilly. In 1996, the book In the Shadow of Isham was published. And the subtitle is Notes from New York. It was the result of Piotrowski's stay on KEMKI Fellowship at Columbia University. And on the one hand, the book was a reckoning with the Soviet utopian avant-garde, which has been defined here as naive and potentially dangerous. And Duchamp was a symbol of ironic, non-totalitarian avant-garde. And on the other hand, it was a kind of methodological toolbox or a guide to critical art history rooted in French theory. So it was a kind of double filter or maybe triple filter, which has been defined, described a guide to critical art history, described chapter by chapter and issue by issue. And of course, it was very useful because also in the post-socialist contemporary, the new space of political struggle has become discourses which, as Derrida wanted, no longer have any exterior. On the same principle, after 1989, there is no longer any outside of capitalism. As Piotrowski noted in his book, quote, the cure, the remedy for present-day indoctrination can no longer be to stand next to capitalist structures because such places simply do not exist. End of talk. In the Shadow of Duchamp perfectly illustrates the mechanism described by Esanu. There is always a new economic order behind the new theory made in USA, as well as in the 40s, 50s, 90s. Finally, in 1999, the book The Meanings of Modernism has been published. It was the first and until last year, the only one, comprehensive study of Polish post-war art written after 1989. Here, Piotrowski has applied the methodology outlined in his previous book. And although single elements of critical art history had functioned in Polish art discourse before, some elements, margins, it was not until the meanings of modernism showed that the entire Polish post-war art history could be effectively examined using this methodology. And also with regard to art after 1989, the meanings of modernism is of fundamental importance. Piotrowski identified as the most important phenomenon of the 1990s the so-called critical art, dealing with those micro-political singularities. In this way, Piotrowski not only outlined a new canon of the 1990s, but above all established a new norms for what is serious or real art. And of course, this smoothly corresponded with this rational or disenchant epistemology. So, the methodological framework established by Piotrowski in the 1990s shows that also critical art history, at least in Poland, was not only a product of, but also agent in the constitution of post-1989 economic and cultural neoliberalism, to go back to Esano's works. Thus, I propose to look at critical art history as a kind of new enclosure. I would like to show this mechanism on the example of the works of Grzegorz Klaman. At the end of the 1990s, Klaman was classified by critical art history as one of the most important artists of the decade. Analyzing his art through this prism, his most important work is Emblems from 1993. Human organs placed in 3 coffers of symbolic shapes. Piotrowski, and later, just a few years, 3 years later, Izabela Kowalczyk, in her significant book Body and Power, which was based on her doctoral dissertation written under supervision of Professor Piotrowski. So, Piotrowski and Kowalczyk interpreted emblems as abject art and a critique of knowledge power contained in the discourses of medicine and culture. Thanks to these readings, emblems has been included into art canon, Polish art canon of the 1990s. I think one can treat this interpretation, among many others, as a kind of symbolic violence, or, to go back to Federici's term, appropriation of the commons that does not fit into the logic of Western modernization. Since this page from Meanings of Modernism. And since 1986 till 1995, Klaman was co-creator of Granary Island, a grassroots community trying to create a model of art based on the idea of the cosmic union of man and nature. The site itself was significant here, an abandoned island in the middle of Gdańsk city, with ruins of 17th century buildings, partly functioning as an open-air studio of the Academy of Fine Arts, but mostly unused, a piece of land outside the enclosures of state and capital. In 1985, Klaman wrote the ecological, communal, cosmic, sacred manifesto entitled Reverse Archaeology. Referring to Silvia Federici, you might say that it was a project of re-enchanting the art. It was a vision that was neither modern nor postmodern, but rather pre-modern. Art is treated here as a communal ritual. The community is more important than the individual. The autonomy of art simply does not exist. And autonomy means here the separation, the separation of the artist from his community, and so on and so on. So the artist is a kind of a shaman here. As Klaman wrote in his manifesto, quote, "In the human-nature relationship, nature existence is equal to human existence. Actions of nature are actions for nature, if only they are directed toward transcendence. The direction of the course of time is no longer obligatory because I do not use the concept of development and progress. End of quote. In the late 80s and early 90s, Klaman came under the strong influence of Gnosticism and early Christian heresy. Klaman created a number of Gnostic works and even organized an entire exhibition devoted to Gnosticism in 1989. It is noteworthy that Silvia Federici treats heretical communities as enclaves resistant to modern enclosure. Granary Island played a similar role, situating itself first outside the communist state and then outside the logic of westernization. And now let's go, and this is the ritual of burning of this piece. And now let's back to the emblems. It is a riddle dedicated to Gnostic anthropology. Gnostic believe that the body, so-called soma, is the lowest form of existence, and the soul, so-called psyche, is the source of false beliefs. Therefore, Gnostic anthropology assumes the existence of a third element, that is spirit, so-called pneuma, a divine spark that has been trapped into every human being. And Gnostic must find it within itself in order to experience spiritual awakening, and awakened Gnostic is united with the universe as a guide for his community and has no material temptations. In emblems, human organs are a symbol of the body, soma, and cultural references like the coffers, the shapes of coffers, symbolize the soul, psyche. And the third element, and the most important one, we do not see, because it is the sound of escaping gas, a symbol of pneuma. The whole piece is enclosed in steel sarcophagus, which is Gnostic symbol of the cosmic prison, in which those who have not yet experienced enlightenment are imprisoned. So, let's have some conclusions. In The Meaning of Modernism, Piotrowski wrote about emblems. Quote, power in its embodiments in the field of culture operates with second-order objects appropriated by the language of ideology. Klaman's emblems, therefore, is an attempt to appeal to a pure language, as Roland Barthes wrote, free of all ideology, since it operates with the identity of signifier and signified, signifiant, signification. Can language exist outside the system of ideology? Now, at the end of the 20th century, we are rather skeptical of such beliefs. End of quote. Critical art history focused on the surface of text and representation not only failed here to take into account what cannot be seen, like the voice of escaping gas, but above all ignored an epistemology that did not fit into the rationality of the post-socialist contemporary. Of course, Klaman's example was not an isolated one. Throughout Poland of the late 80s and 1990s, art based on an epistemology of the common, such as unity of man, culture, caring, sharing, or even existence of a non-rational mystical power was developing. There were dozens of names, several thriving communities and places, and many artworks and a lot of events. As far as I know, similar phenomena also occurred in other CEE countries during the transition era. Despite this scale, this enchantment art is not part of the Polish canon. There are no monographs on the subject. It is not written about in the most important studies, Polish art of the 90s. It is not in museum collections or syllabuses. Its iconography and philosophical assumptions are not analyzed. I think that the scope, richness, and complexity of this phenomenon is a significant research and methodological challenge today. However, it is already possible to put forward the thesis that the new enclosures also concern art history, its hierarchies, epistemology, or, to say so, default system of values, a kind of doxa. In that sense, critical art history of the 1990s was transitological, as defined by Boris Budin in his Zone of Transition, which means it assumed that it was enough to implement objective norms, here methodological norms, to turning post-communist, backward post-communist into the liberal democracy open society, and so on. It can be said that critical art history itself was the knowledge power of Polish post-socialist contemporary. To use Piotrowski's own words, no language can exist outside the system of ideology. And the theoretical framework of re-enchanting allows us to tell the different story about the art of the transition era and to see influence of new enclosures on critical art history. Oh, thank you very much.